Hello and welcome to another in our series of Human Synergistics webinars. Happy for you to join me today live. Thank you for taking the time. Our topic today is one that I've had many questions about over the years, and hopefully this will serve as a helpful resource. And that is when we're talking about the topic of organizational culture, really, how do we introduce this to leadership teams in particular? How do we take that first step with them in a day, as we've mentioned, or even in a half day, to help them to understand what is culture, how that affects their business moving forward, what sorts of things we might want to focus on. So. The session that I'm going to take you through, this PowerPoint deck, by the way, is something that we're happy to make available. So if you would like this, please reach out. I know that as we go through, a lot of the text will be a little bit too small to read. So happy to share this with you. The thing I would stress, however, is that this presentation is a sort of a generic, stripped down basic version. It's really not so much about the content, I think, as much as it's about the narrative, the journey that it helps to take a leadership team on, for example, from the point of, what is our purpose and our burning platform, to how does this connect to topics like leadership and culture, and where does that lead us next. So I hope it helps to do that. As we go through, I'll talk about a lot of ways that this can be customized and a lot of things that I would make sure to include when if I were taking a client or a new leadership team through this presentation. The other thing I would stress is that before we get into introducing topics like culture and I think even leadership in terms of organizational development, it's helpful to know as much as we can about the purpose of this conversation. So typically, the reason that a leadership team may be interested in the topic of culture, or perhaps the reason that you as a coach or consultant feel it would be helpful to introduce this topic to your client, is ultimately because it connects to a greater purpose burning platform that the organization or leadership team has. So for the purpose of today's discussion, and again, we're live. Again, welcome. Thank you for everyone for coming. If you'd like to participate, ask any questions along the way, please feel free to do that via the chat. Um, so as we introduce these concepts to leaders, again, it helps us to have that structure, and it always helps us to have a reference point in terms of why are we talking about this? What is ultimately the purpose, the passion or platform from which this topic of development, growth, improvement, and thereby culture and leadership stems. Good. With that understanding, then I think we can move ahead with the content that I have. Again, feel free to reach out if you'd like this material. Here we go. So the first couple of slides that I have, and again, this can be done more interactively, but are to focus really on basically defining and communicating what is culture. The word culture is, of course, used in many contexts. So getting clear in terms of what we're talking about with reference to organizational culture, what that is in terms of essentially patterns in how your people approach their work and how they work with one another. And that those patterns playing out across the business are not only what we're defining as organizational culture, but also have a direct and significant impact on the well-being and performance of people working within that culture. So this is a very important concept. You'll see this referred to throughout the presentation. But again, it's not just the fact of measuring culture that's helpful, it's understanding the causal relationship between those patterns and the kinds of objectives that we have as an organization. So to go back to the example of adaptability and innovation, I think I mentioned as we go through this presentation, it'll be easier to have a reference in terms of what kind of purpose might a leadership team have for this kind of development. One of the most common purposes that I hear today, and I think it's growing and I don't think it will slow down, is adaptability, innovation, anti anti-fragility in organizations, leadership teams, and so on. So if we use that adaptability, innovation as a purpose, then it's helpful, again, not only to introduce what culture is in an organization, but how culture influences the ability of our people to be innovative in their work, approach their tasks and each other in creative and adaptive ways, and act on those behaviors that enable us as an organization and a team to functionally adapt and change. So just 2 slides there, probably gone into it too much, but again, introducing what is culture in terms of a definition and why that matters. And I think one of the things that you will always find and is helpful for clients and organizations and leadership teams as well, is to recognize not only how powerful the influence of culture is upon our ability to perform most effectively, but how broad that impact is as well. So you'll see this referenced a few times through the presentation, but we look at everything from the ability of people to think creatively, solve problems adaptively, to levels of stress and well-being and engagement and motivation and frequency of errors and safety and customer service and profitability and sustainability and so on. So recognizing, again, those patterns within the business are, again, not only powerful, but tremendously broad in their impact. It's helpful to connect this topic, again, clearly back to our purpose. Okay. With that very brief introduction of kind of the concept of culture, then I like to use an exercise. Interactive exercises are very helpful for the learning process, and I find this one to be particularly good. So this is what I refer to as the wall chart exercise. This is something I've discussed many times before. I have a separate webinar that's been recorded where I discuss different ways to introduce human synergistics tools and models, and the wall chart exercise is featured predominantly there. This can be done in a variety of different ways. One of the things I really like about the wall chart exercise is how flexible it is and adaptive it is as an exercise. But again, for the purpose of today, I'll just focus on one way that it is used very commonly, and I think that will make sense for you. This, again, also can be done face-to-face or virtually very, very effectively. So the version of the exercise here is essentially we're asking a leadership team to think about that purpose. Again, in this case, we need adaptive, innovative people and teams in our organization. We need that behavior happening more often, more frequently, and so on. The question then is, what's going to enable that to happen? What do we need to see from our people in order to drive that innovation? And what kinds of things might get in the way? So this is done with a little poster activity. I know these are too small to read. I'll flip through them individually in a moment. Again, the purpose isn't to read each poster right now, but to recognize kind of what we're doing. The point here is that we're giving leaders essentially examples of different types of behavior, what we call styles of behavior. And they're asking them which of those styles is appropriate in your organizations, which are not, which of these are going to help contribute to and enable our people to, again, be more innovative, more adaptive, uh, grow anti-fragility in our business, and so on. This exercise takes about 15 minutes. Again, it can be done many different ways. My preferred way to do this is with both positive and negative votes, so that leaders or members can recognize and identify the behaviors that will help us to be adaptive and innovative and flexible moving forward, as well as what behaviors might get in the way, hold us back, or make it more difficult for us to adapt and change. And that is a very helpful exercise. Again, takes about 15 minutes. And then I basically, this is a nice time to take a little 15-minute coffee break, reflect on what we've described, again, the innovation we need moving forward, and kind of what patterns are going to help enable us to get there, and which might get in the way. At this time, I basically am collecting those scores in terms of what people described. And this is then my opportunity to introduce a bit more of human synergistics and our model. So we've talked about culture, we've talked about what it is and why it matters, and we've talked about how it connects to the purpose of their business. In order to be agile and adaptive, these are the kinds of behaviors that we need. The next few slides sort of shift gears and allow us to take the moment to introduce human synergistics as an organization, what our business is about. If you're not familiar with us, please reach out. Happy to give you additional content. Happy to introduce you more to our circumplex model in our free circumplex accreditations. But for the purpose of our webinar today, I'll assume you're somewhat familiar, and we'll continue with the narrative. So as we introduce human synergistics, again, that's a lot around the idea of measuring with statistical reliability and validity patterns of behavior, particularly with reference to this discussion playing out across organizations in terms of culture. And that it's not just valuable to measure culture for the purpose of understanding those patterns playing out, but perhaps most importantly, we understand them in a causal framework in terms of how those patterns are influencing and impacting, again, various measures of our people's well-being and ability to perform. And in fact, we can customize those kinds of performance criteria so that we can look not only at your culture, but how it is specifically influencing specific KPIs, deliverables in your business, in your industry. So making that connection between culture and performance, very clear, very tangible, is at the core purpose of what we do. A couple of slides to show that we do this not only at the individual level, for example, with individual leader behavior, but we also, of course, and primarily for the focus of our discussion here, we'll be talking about those patterns in terms of organizational culture and how they influence business outcomes in terms of, again, the well-being and effectiveness of our people, as well as their ability to perform at their best. Once that kind of causal relationship is introduced, that is what we measure with our tools. And the purpose of this is to understand the current patterns, not in terms of good or bad or right or wrong, but in terms of what is playing out and how is that affecting our people and performance. And moving forward, what kinds of behavior should we role model, encourage, and enable as leaders to more consistently and predictably drive the kind of adaptability and innovation that our organization needs, and making that relationship transparent and tangible, I think is a key to what we do. So when we then shift and focus a bit on measuring culture specifically, that's measured using this circumplex model. And again, even in a half-day introduction, I give a little bit of context around the circumplex so that leaders can understand what they've described essentially as we've moved forward in terms of what's going to help us be more effective, more adaptive. So we'll skip through here. Again, I do quite regularly a 4-hour training on our circumplex model, task versus people orientation, satisfaction versus security orientation, has a lot to do with the motivations behind these patterns. In any case, if you're interested to learn much more about this model and how it connects to perhaps your organization, how it explains culture, please feel free to reach out. In any case, as you can see, I don't go particularly deep into the details of the model. As far as I go, perhaps for the leadership team at this point, it's just giving them a good understanding of what is constructive versus passive versus aggressive defensive patterns, kind of the flavor in terms of how those play out, and that those are the sorts of things that we're measuring in this model. All right. Once we have a concept of again what that model is and the patterns we're measuring at a very high level, then it's helpful again to reconnect this to the fact that we're not just measuring those patterns, but the purpose is really to understand how those patterns are influencing our people and performance. And we can show data here, and thankfully we have over 50 years, decades of global data looking at individual, team, and organizational behavioral patterns patterns and how those influence member well-being, team effectiveness, problem solving, performance, and so on across KPI criteria. So if there's any of that kind of example data that you're interested or specifically looking for, please let us know. But that is a very powerful message and something we can show and demonstrate to organizations when we actually, a few steps further in the journey, when we do an actual culture project with them utilizing the OCI. Again, we can not only measure these patterns in their business, but also measure their employees described and measured, creativity, ability to be adaptive, the frequency of using adaptive creative approaches. And you'll see within your own organization what kind of behavior enables and what kind of behavior inhibits their ability to be creative in their work. And that's really what we're looking at here across a host of different criteria. And what you'll tend to see in the data, and what we can, of course, back up with very good research, is that it is those blue, what we described earlier as constructive behaviors, that tend to most positively and consistently drive performance in people, whether they're individuals or working in groups and teams or working more broadly across organizations. So a little bit of research just to connect the patterns in culture to the performance and the purpose by which we're using these tools and interested in the topic. So that's our circumplex model. And again, as deep as we will dive into it. The next slide is just introducing the specific instrument that we use to measure these patterns in organizations with reference to culture. That is the Organizational Culture Inventory. Again, it's been used for decades across all the world, across industries, and a lot of wonderful case studies, examples, references, and research to back up the reliability, validity, and usefulness of this data. It's not just giving clients good information that creates change. It's the fact that good information enables them to understand why things are happening, where change needs to be, where development needs to be focused, and how we actually implement that in a way that predictably drives what we're looking for. How do we predictably drive that creativity, innovation that we need to see in our business? Good metrics give you the transparency that you need to understand how we as leaders and need to drive that, as we'll show. Okay. So not only is this a useful tool to measure culture, but the purpose again of this is to create an understanding and to learn from that, so that moving forward we can make even more effective choices around how we work to create a positive development journey for the organization. Again, it's not that there's anything wrong with the existing culture. It's that with this kind of data and perspective, we're able to recognize that moving forward there are even better ways that we could do things. And that's what this kind of development is really about. Okay. So with that context, then we're going to shift gears back to our exercise that we've done earlier with the leadership team. So again, we've now given them a little bit of a deep dive into human synergistics, the models in terms of cause and effect, what is culture and how we measure that, and so on. The next step then is to connect this back with what they described. So as they will have remembered about half an hour ago, we will have done this wall chart exercise, and they will have voted for and against certain patterns in terms of what is appropriate, what is helpful, and essentially what is not, in order to drive innovation in our business. I really don't want to, I'll take just one more moment because I don't want to understate how helpful this is. It is a simple exercise, but it is a big step, and in a way it kind of builds a bridge for leaders to not, they're already clear typically on their purpose. They realize that they need to be more innovative and their business needs to be more adaptive. That is clear. What's less clear and less obvious is what kind of behavior and actions I need to role model, my team needs to exhibit, we need to encourage in this business in order to drive that kind of innovation and adaptability. adaptability. And that's at least at a high level, and is an exercise. That is the kind of bridge that this wall chart exercise does. So when they, again, thinking about the innovation and adaptability that we need, and then we looking at what we wanted versus what we don't want in our business, you'll get a rough description and you'll begin to see a pattern, something along these lines. So these are actual OCI ideal culture descriptions across global region. We have other research articles published on this as well. Very, very interesting in terms of the differences between societies, as well as how these patterns have slightly shifted over the years. But in any case, the point is that this is the kind of thing that will be described as most positive, appropriate, and consistent with an adaptive organization moving forward. So for those of you who are in the consultant or facilitating role, this is sort of a nice thing, because it means you kind of know what the leaders or the members are going to describe as the primary patterns that we need moving forward in order to, again, in this case, be more adaptive and flexible. So we can be a little more specific and talk about this. So it's going to make a lot of intuitive sense that the more people are, cooperating with one another, being supportive, focusing on goals, maintaining standards of excellence, those are the kinds of behaviors that are going to help lead us forward. But just to clarify that, again, the beauty here is that human synergistics finds the same pattern as you've seen in our data. But what we're doing with this kind of exercise is we're actually asking leaders first, what do you need in order to be more adaptive? And they will tend to recognize and identify what we call constructive patterns as being most positive and conducive to their goals. We then not only are essentially agreeing with that description, but then further reinforcing that realization by the fact that, and that's exactly what we find when we look at thousands of other organizations, as they become more constructive in their cultures, they become more adaptive in their ability to change and deliver. And we can prove that and show that consistently. So it's a nice synergy of messaging in terms of what we say and recognize we need is in fact what objectively can be demonstrated as effective and functional. I like this slide. This is sort of also making the point, when leaders reflect on things like, what helps people to feel like they're working for a sense of purpose. They're accomplishing meaningful things. They're building meaningful networks with their colleagues and so on. They're contributing to something that has a purpose that's intrinsically rewarding. When we think about those kinds of motivations, those are falling within those constructive patterns. So again, we're not telling leaders and organizations this. We really are asking this. It's something that they will realize as they go through the exercise. And we then get to reinforce. And again, while this is not a measurement, it is a clear description and a recognition of, moving forward, if we want more, again, in this case, adaptability and innovation, here are the kinds of behaviors that are going to facilitate and make that possible. That's what we need in this organization, in our people. And that's really, I hopefully along this journey so far, we've learned several things, right? What is culture? How it influences causally things like well-being and performance, how it connects directly to and influences directly our purpose. Again, being innovative, adaptive, and creative. We've learned that we can measure these things. We've learned that if we do that, we can get specific on what helps and what doesn't. We've described that for ourselves, again, not with measurement in this case. For that, we would really recommend next step is an ideal description using the OCI so that we have a really clear description. But in any case, again, if we're talking about the first day that we're sitting down with a leadership team, this is the first time we have a chance to introduce the topic of culture. I think this is about as far in the journey as we can really proceed with them before we need to get good data using an assessment. and really is as much as leaders kind of can take on board and process, if that's fair, all the way back to, this message, which is the one I tend to try to leave with them, which is, once you understand what culture is and how it drives your innovation and what kinds of behavior, and again, just for simplicity, I'm going to sum this up in terms of its constructive behavior that the client and we will be able to show, help with innovation. That again should be a really helpful crystallization in terms of, again, what we need to encourage, what we need to do more of, and so on. The next message, and the last one that I would try to make in that first day or first half day of a leadership introduction, is how they connect to this. I think, while this is all interesting and educational, I think it resonates more impactfully when leaders suddenly realize how they directly connect to all of what we've talked about so far. And they do, absolutely, and we can of course show that. And again, that's another thing that we do measure, not only how these patterns play out in organizations, but how they're encouraged and fostered and role modeled by individual leaders. And we use the same circumplex and same model to do that. So when we start thinking as leaders about if we truly want a more innovative and adaptive organization moving forward, we have to recognize that's only going to happen if we create a workplace that inspires curiosity, that allows people to try something new, that welcomes people speaking up when they have different ideas, where people feel like they're valued. And if that's the kind of blue constructive culture that we want, then we as leaders have to take ownership and create that. There are a lot of things, and we can demonstrate this, that drive culture, but leadership is consistently right at the top of the list. The way leaders behave, the role model that they set, the actions that they take have a direct influence on the way that their team responds and behaves, and the patterns that play on beyond that in the organization. It's a fascinating thing to measure, but at this point, it's an important takeaway for leadership teams to understand where they fit in all of this. And that while, yes, culture has influenced them and impacts their behavior, they too influence the culture as well. And if we're talking about a senior leadership team, it really is, and we can demonstrate primarily the leaders that are influencing the culture. And so at that point, we really have the opportunity to break the cycle of what's been happening so far in the business, even if it's been working great, with the recognition that moving forward, we want even greater, then we need to know what to do. And we also need to take those initial steps as leaders to, again, create that new expectation, draw attention to the behavior that we do need in the future, encourage and facilitate that. And this is, even as we talk with clients over years and years, this is the way that we primarily drive positive, systemic, sustainable change in organizations. All right. I think that's the takeaway that I'll leave with you as well today. I hope this has been helpful. I've done this with a lot of leadership teams. Again, you're going to want to adapt this based on their unique purpose, their industry, their situation. Of course, there are a lot of things to take into consideration. If you're accredited and have a client in mind that you're preparing to introduce these ideas to, please reach out. I'd be very happy to give you templates and examples. If you're not accredited and would like information on how to be, or how further information on how these tools are used, please feel free to reach out anytime. We're always happy to help you. Thank you very much. I hope this has been a help. Again, we will record this and save this on our website so that you can refer back to it anytime. Thank you so much for taking part.